Hello and welcome back to On the Workbench. Today we're taking a look at the Kobalt 24 volt max brushless chainsaw. This is a kit, if you will, that includes a battery and a charger. So if we look at the back, this is a 12-inch chainsaw. And so what this has is, here's the little quick specs, up to 120 cuts on a single charge based on the 4 amp hour battery, 13.5 meters per second of chain speed. I'm not sure why they don't put that in standard or US customary measurements. 7.6 pounds with the 4 amp hour battery and the 12-inch bar. All right, so what do you get in the box? That's probably the big question, and that's why you're watching. Inside the box, this is what we get. We get the chain. Looks like we'll have to put that on. We have the Kobalt standard basic charger, if you will. The instruction manual. A 4 amp hour battery. And so out of the box, this one has 2 bars on it. I'll make sure we give that a full charge. We have another manual at the bottom for the battery. We have our bar cover. We get the tool. Another manual about the charger. And we also get the bar. What I do not see in the box that I think is perhaps just as important is I do not see any bar and chain oil. If you're using a chainsaw, the importance of having bar and chain oil to lubricate everything is very important, and that is not contained in the box. So you will need to buy that separately, and I did not see that appear as prominently on the box as I would have liked. So we've got another little marketing tag here. It looks like this is basically set up so that if someone wants to put this on display, you have that. All right, so we got our slot here for the battery. I have another fully charged 4 amp hour battery. Slides right in with extra clearance on the side. We have our trigger in the rear. We have our chain brake here in the front. Always make sure you set that before you use it. And then on the side, right over here is where we would add our bar and chain oil. You're going to want to make sure you add that. I was kind of expecting that Kobalt would have included a little small trial size vial of bar and chain oil, but obviously they didn't. So you need to make sure you pick up some of that if you consider buying this tool. So one of the reasons why I bought this, and I'm not a huge fan of the electric brushless battery outdoor power equipment, is that I don't want to buy a 2-cycle chainsaw. The only other chainsaw that I have is a pole saw that attaches to my 4-cycle string trimmer. I don't want to mess with oil and gas. I remember as a kid, my dad had one gas can for the lawnmower that was a 2-cycle mix. Another gas can that was a different ratio for the 2-cycle string trimmer. A third gas can for the 2-cycle chainsaw. And I don't know, he might have had another one that was that was just regular gas from the gas station for the car on the side. And he just had too many gas cans, in my opinion. And he never let me fuel things up when I was young. And now I understand why, because there was just a lot going on there. So a couple other little things here is you'll notice that one of the things that did not come out of this box was a scrunch for being able to control our chain tension. Also interesting, I was expecting to see that a number of chainsaws will usually say something along the lines of bar by Oregon or something to that effect. This one does not say that anywhere. There's a little gear here at the end that we'll need to line up with our chain. And then just for reference, so if you're thinking about expanding this with a longer bar, the bar height on here, if you will, is about 2 2/16 inch across. The diameter, the spacing between these two holes here is right about 1 inch from center to center. Oh, one of the other things here that I think is interesting on this, which to me is one of the limiting factors on this, are the bucking spikes, is these are plastic. And I think this is certainly an area where Kobalt cheaped out on the saw, that in my opinion, these should be metal. And the excuse for them not making these metal to me is inescapable, that these should have been steel or at the very least aluminum. But this is, to me alone, is a good indication of them intending to purposely try to limit you from putting on aftermarket bars that are longer than what they intended, because you really want to make sure you've got a good set of bucking spikes on your chainsaw if you're going to be cutting large material. So now for installing the chain, I just had to unscrew that a few times, and that pulls right off. And if we look here on the side, we can see where the chain lies. We got our sprocket for the chain. And then we have our chain that will go right here. And then the adjustment, let me get the back side of this cover here. Looks like this, and you can see there's this pin here that will then go into the setup like this. And this is what's going to drive the bar front to back. Just in terms of looking at the setup here, there's obviously another pin here, so between this screw and this metal pin here, when this is all put together, it's what's going to help to keep this from going back and forth. In my opinion, I would like to have seen a second metal pin here, and for these pins to be a larger diameter, that if I lay this all the way down and on top of this, there is still a lot of play in there. I would like to have had that been a much more tight fit to ensure a positive connection. Now the chain looks like it likely comes in some form of pre-lubrication. Be careful taking the chain out of the bag, obviously. I'm going to drop that there onto the workbench. And we're going to stretch out the chain. There we go. So now we have our chain all stretched out and unbound. When it comes to assembling the bar and chain, a couple little details here matter, because there actually is a right and a wrong way to handle the chain. So a couple of things here on this chain. At the top of the bar, assuming if you're going to have the word Kobalt go up so it's legible, because you can install this technically where the word Kobalt is upside down, doesn't matter. But if you just make it legible, what you want on the top is these, what looks like shark fins, to be looking like there's a shark swimming towards you. So it's got a slightly more aerodynamic look, because then on the back side, or I shouldn't say the back side, but the bottom side, then that will then glide into the wood, and then we'll slice it. So it provides a little bit of what's known as the depth gauge. And then we just simply have to make sure you get it also around the sprocket at the end of the bar. And then we're going to place it onto the tool like this. You might have to move it just a bit to make sure that the teeth will engage well with the sprocket that's on the tool. Make sure you don't have any parts of the chain bound underneath the bar before we put the cover on. So if I just slide that up a little bit with my finger. Again, make sure if you're doing this, make sure the battery is not in. That provides you the level of safety that's necessary. And then we can put the cover on. It might take a little bit of movement of the bar to get the bar to line up with the tension adjustment part. And then we can slide that on and then turn the knob clockwise to tighten. So this is a normal right-hand thread screw. And then if we observe that our chain is too loose, we can adjust our tension knob before we get this too tight. And then we can tighten or loosen the chain. Over time, the chain will stretch. Chains are not static. So I can loosen this up like this, where there's way too much slack in the chain. I can push this little knob up here, and you can see it's tightening up the chain. We're going to want a little bit, maybe just a little bit tighter than that. That's probably about right. And you have to keep an eye on that, especially on a new chain before it kind of sets in. And when you get the tension right, just go ahead and turn this knob down, and that'll tighten that up there. So that's very easy to set up here. I really like the fact that it's toolless. Few little quirks under there in terms of what I think they could do better in terms of that bar mechanism. Like I said before, I like to see 2 pins in there rather than 1. A little more steel, the better. So one of the other big things here, now if you're using this saw correctly, this won't be a problem. Because if you got one hand on top and one hand here, then all of your hands are accounted for. What's very important is if you go to set this down, or you go to grab it somewhere else, again, both hands should be occupied here. There is no reason for your hands to be elsewhere on the tool, but what they have here, at the very bottom, if you look down here, you can see, now this would be where a lot of your sawdust is going to come out and is going to clear out of the bottom. What I'm kind of surprised they didn't do is put just a very coarse grate over here or something to kind of prevent a finger from slipping in there, because I can very easily slide my fingers in there where the chain is located, and clearly that's not something that we want to be doing. Obviously, one of the advantages of this is you can be positive that the saw is without power by removing the battery. So that provides us some positive assurance. So I'm going to take a different fully charged battery, and I'm going to go ahead and put on here. And then now I'm going to hold on here and try to squeeze the trigger. On the left side of the trigger, you can see there's a little extra safety that has to be depressed to even be able to pull up on this. And if I pull up on it, you can see this is getting nothing. And I can pull up on that and I get nothing on the trigger. Why is that? That is because my brake here is not set. Now that that brake is set, now you can see I was able to run the saw. You also hopefully observed that there is a fairly decent brake or chain brake to be able to shut down the saw very quickly after this is depressed. Again, one of the nice pieces of this being electric, that there's not any extra momentum hanging around from the pistons as they reciprocate within the engine cylinder, that it can shut down right away, and electric motors have more torque than gas engines. So if you can pull over that safety pin, we've got that, and now she's all set to use. Like I said before, be mindful that on a new saw, the chain will stretch a little bit over time, so you want to pay attention to that, and you absolutely must add bar and chain oil to this before you start cutting. And don't forget, there's the extra little safety switch here, and the button over here. Conveniently, how this is set up here, you can still have easy access to check the status of your battery while it's on top. And it does have what I would consider generally the foot plate here, where I would put my foot when I go to pull the cord to start the saw. There's no reason to do that because this is electric, but that's still here to be able to create a nice balanced tool. So now I'm going to put this in action. I got some brush to cut up. All right, I want to do a quick follow-up here on this chainsaw here. I've had this now for a little over 3 months and put a fair bit of use into it. You can see when I pulled the cover off here, it dumped a fair bit of debris over my workbench here. And so far for my needs, I've got to say this saw has worked really well. It's had enough torque to be able to deal with a bunch of tree trimmings, to be able to cut up into smaller pieces tree limbs that had fallen, as well as to take out one, I guess, relatively small tree with no problem. And I've used it for a little bit of stump grinding. I know it's not really a stump grinder, but if you can kind of get a chainsaw up to a stump and dig around it, you can kind of grind a stump with a chainsaw. And that's one of the places where I think a shorter bar chainsaw works better, that you don't want to have a bar that's too long that limits your ability to get in to a tight spot to work on trying to eliminate a stump below the ground. If you're going to do that, make sure you trench around it with a shovel. So a couple things I've learned using this saw. First of all, a replacement blade can be gotten from Oregon, which is the blade code R45, and it works fantastic. There's no reason to actually reach for the Kobalt blade. And when I made the change, I felt like I liked the saw a lot more than the stock blade that came with it, or stock chain that came with it. And I believe this is something like 12 bucks or something like that. It's not too expensive. And in my opinion, it's worth it to be able to have it, and I just felt like it cut so much better with the chain. Let me see if I can put these two chains side by side. So the chain on the saw is the Oregon, and then I've saved the stock chain here, and that's the loose one beside it here. All right, so I've got the two chains here lined up side by side as close as I can with the similar blade positions. The chain that's on the saw right now, that's right here, is the Oregon. The one in my hands is the Kobalt chain that came with it. And maybe you can see there's just a slight difference in the makeup of the chain. It seems that in a couple places the Kobalt chain is just a little bit thicker in a couple of the places. And it's assembled a little bit differently. And I think that that might be enough. Just ever so small differences is enough to be able to add up to a noticeable difference in cut quality. Because once I put the Oregon chain on and dump the Kobalt one, I cut a lot better. Now, to be fair, wearing out the chain, there was some degraded performance from wearing through the chain, and this chain definitely would need to be sharpened before I would put it back into service. But I just made the quick attempt to use or to go out and buy the Oregon chain to compare the cut quality. And so for at least in my book, I think jumping to the Oregon chain is something that is worthwhile. I'd be curious to know where Kobalt sources their chain from. And if it is Oregon, I mean, it's similar, but it's still different enough, I think, that it's making a difference. I know maybe it's hard to see on camera here exactly how they compare side by side. I hope I'm making this somewhat easy. All right, so here's another angle looking at the chain and how it compares. Again, the chain that's on the saw on the back side is the Oregon, the one in my hands. To the front side here is the Kobalt. And so there's the side by side. And if I turn the teeth like this, hopefully you can see that there's a little bit of a difference in it, that I think these are just a little bit thinner on the Oregon for, I guess, what I would call a follower. I'm not super hip to the proper chainsaw knowledge, but these just seem to be a little bit thinner and therefore a little bit sharper and easier to cut. Now maybe that'll affect the long-term quality of it. I'm not sure compared to the Kobalt chain. But in any case, that's been my experience so far with it. And one of the other things in terms of thinking about the saw here that I've not had any issues with, that I was concerned with, was how much of the bar and chain oil would leak out onto my garage floor. I've had almost nothing leak out on it, so I've been very happy in that regard. Although you can see just from use that there's a fair bit of sawdust that has built up on it from it kind of splattering a little bit of oil, and it gets, you know, kind of stuck to the outside, but you kind of expect that for a chainsaw. One more detail with this that I want to point out is that I really think this tool is one that's made for the 6 amp hour battery, that when I put this in to the tool, it definitely adds some weight to it. I'm not going to click it in all the way right now, but it does fit completely with no problem with the 6 amp hour battery, and it adds a little bit of extra heft to it that, in my opinion, actually improves the feel of the tool as well as gives it some extra longevity. And like I showed before, if you don't have that, and you've got one of these 4 amp hour ultimate output, those also fit in here as well. And so I'm very pleased with that. I've used it with both batteries, but just from a feel perspective, I feel like just the extra weight of the 6 amp hour makes it feel a little bit better, at least to me. Obviously, there's going to be some personal preferences in play there, but I would not use this with a 2 amp hour battery, because I was able to go through a 6 amp hour battery in about 25 to 30 minutes of pretty solid use before I had to switch to another battery. And then as long as you've got a charger in the background that you can be cycling batteries through, you can run this for quite a while. And the battery did come off a little bit warm, but still works great. I've had no problems with the saw and have no problems recommending it for its intended use. Obviously, this is not intended to go clearing large brush in a large forest. One other item to pay attention to with this is the chain tension. As you can see here, there's quite a bit of slack in the chain. And as I've used this, I've had to make sure I pay very careful attention to keeping the chain with the appropriate amount of tension in it so it doesn't slip out too far like that. That a chain will stretch when you put on a new chain, but I felt like this locking mechanism doesn't quite get it as tight as I would prefer. Now maybe I could try to crank it down a little bit harder, and maybe I've been a little too timid because I don't want to break the plastic here, but this does not come with the usual chainsaw scrunch that you can just give it a good old oomph when you tighten it down. You've got the thumb wheel, and I feel like this does get just a hair loose, and that has resulted in the chain getting a little bit, with a little bit of extra slack in it that I don't like. But if you just have a watchful eye on it, it's not that big of a deal to work around and to tighten your chain and to put that tension back on it, so then you can have a properly running chainsaw. And so with that, I think I've really liked this chainsaw for its intended use for where you would use a 12-inch or 12-inch bar chainsaw. I suspect you probably could add on a longer bar and chain to this if you wanted to. I've not really had a reason to do that personally at this time. But for what it is, I think it's worked great, and I've really enjoyed using it for what I need to. It hasn't leaked on my floor, so I've not had puddles of bar and chain oil on the floor of my garage, and I've been relatively happy. So if you're in the market for a 24-volt chainsaw, or really I guess a cordless chainsaw, and you're in the Kobalt battery platform, I wouldn't hesitate to recommend this. I think it's worked well, and it's served my purposes well so far this year in 2020. Any other questions or comments, or your own experiences with it, feel free to share it down below in the comments. Anything else you want to ask? Again, put in the comments below. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, give it a thumbs up. Click the subscribe button if you haven't already done so, and have a great day. Bye.